As a child, I used to refer to raisins as fufra. I can't tell you why, but I do know from stories that I was adamant about this as a toddler. I had an aunt who was especially peeved by this. She would tell me to say ray, and I would, then say sin, and I would, then say raisin. Nope, fufra. For some reason, calling raisins fufra was the hill I was willing to die on. Until I wasn't. By the time I was of school age, I called them raisins, in the same matter-of-fact manner that I referred to them as fufra just a year or two prior. In 2017, the European Court of Justice ruled that non-dairy products like oat milk cannot be called by dairy names. Instead, oat milk would be known as oat drink. That sounds delicious. This got me thinking though, milk may be agreed upon in Europe as mammary secretions, not my words, theirs, but in America, using the phrase oat milk is perfectly acceptable language. Why? Reddit user Obedient Sandwich provided this defense of plant-based milks. The term milk is an old chemistry term referring to a heterogeneous mixture of insoluble compounds. Colloid is the modern term. Think milk of magnesia, used as an antacid. It is called a milk because the magnesium hydroxide doesn't dissolve and just forms a suspension. Almond milk is a suspension of ground up almond particles. Cow milk is a suspension of fat particles that won't dissolve. This is why milk is homogenized, because it wants to form a floating fat layer and water layer. That's unappealing, so they fake making it look the same throughout. It is not a homogeneous solution. So anything you can mix up in water that doesn't dissolve and it stays suspended is milk. I'll be honest, this user sounds like he knows what he's talking about. After all, he is using chemical compound abbreviations. But when it comes down to it, his answer to our question is that last statement. Anything you can mix up in water that doesn't dissolve and stays suspended is milk. Have you ever gotten some milk?
So you've had soy milk and almond milk. Now try the hottest new craze, beef milk.
Okay, have you ever gotten some beef milk from the fridge that you haven't touched in several days? I'm talking about that chemical sweet spot when it doesn't smell bad, but it's a bit thick on top. I know, I'm making oat drink sound like a delicacy right now, but here's the thing. Left untouched, the fat in milk will separate from the water and rise to the top. In other words, left to its own devices and given enough time, the very thing we can actually all agree upon as milk wouldn't meet Obedient Sandwich's definition of milk. In all fairness, he does acknowledge that this is what milk wants to form, but then sand stirred into a cup of water that will eventually separate would also be considered milk. I would like to give a point to the plant milk crowd in this fierce debate. One point I see made time and time again is that when coconut milk was the only mainstream non-dairy milk, nobody seemed a bit bothered. It's only when soy and almond milk went mainstream that people started to fuss. Still, Obedient Sandwich's definition didn't satisfy me. So I went to the most well-respected source of definitions on earth, the Oxford English Dictionary. Upon visiting the page for milk, beef milk lovers will rejoice, as definition 1A states that milk comes from female mammals. It also makes a reference to the ever so scholarly journal Teen Breakfast Guide, which reads, "Cookies and milk for breakfast? Here's a way to have a morning treat and still please your parents." I don't know about any of you, but there's no way my parents would have been pleased with me for having cookies and milk for breakfast. I think Teen Breakfast Guide was either targeting readers desperate for justification of bad habits or just trying to cause a fuss. Either way, I thoroughly enjoy that this is the first modern English reference that the Oxford English Dictionary chooses to display for such a common word. Unfortunately for beef milk lovers and Teen Breakfast Guide readers, it's time to hold your horses because definition 2A is another victory for plant milk lovers everywhere. Not only does it reference milk that comes from plants, it also gives us a timeline. While dairy milk is referenced throughout history earlier and more frequently, we can see that milk as a reference to that which comes from plants becomes more commonly used at the turn of the 15th century. The fact that this language is still being contested hundreds of years later is bizarrely captivating for what should be a completely mundane and uninteresting topic. But we're here now, so let's keep digging. A look at how milk has trended on Google over the last 20 years shows a graph that increases more steadily than an S&P 500 index fund. Americans cannot get enough. Don't believe me? Here's the same graph of milk compared to the celebrity that exists to trend, Kim Kardashian. Aside from some admittedly massive but short spikes, milk has been more trendy than Kim K for the better part of 2 decades, and the gap continues to grow. So what the heck is driving America's insatiable interest in milk? Fairlife, which, while not dairy-free, is free of lactose, followed by the main contributor, plant-based milks. And Milk Makeup? That's a vegan cosmetic brand. Any milk they're using is plant-based too. It seems that this case is open and shut. Plant-based milk has historical backing and modern significance. But what about that ruling from the European Court of Justice earlier? According to Professor Rachel Ankeny, and I'm really sorry if I've butchered your name, her Australian government tried something similar. Her argument is that this debate has little to do with lexicology and more to do with propping up the dairy industry. There are European vegans who share a similar sentiment. Unsurprisingly, the European Dairy Association disagrees based on what they argue is a critical difference between dairy milk and plant-based milks. Plant-based drinks are of plant origin, whereas milk is of animal origin. Plant-based drinks are highly processed, with many ingredients added, whereas plain milk is minimally processed, with fat standardization, homogenization, and thermal treatment, and has no added ingredients. Milk is naturally nutrient-rich. Plant-based drinks are usually enriched with vitamins and minerals to mimic the natural nutrient content of milk. For taste reasons, most plant-based drinks are sweetened and flavored to make them more appealing. Milk, however, can be consumed directly, as its taste is perfectly suited for direct consumption. Plant-based drinks compete with milk on the same market, even though plant-based drinks and milk are completely different products, both from a technological and nutritional point of view. I think there are 2 key arguments being put forth here. The first is that nutrients are added to plant-based milk as opposed to the naturally occurring nutrients in dairy milk. Before we dive into comparing the nutritional value of each, I just want to say I don't love this argument. A daily multivitamin doesn't exist without processing, but I'm still better off having it than not. Additionally, at least in America, it's common for vitamin D to be added to dairy milk. I understand the implication is still less processing for dairy milk compared to plant-based milk, but not all processing is inherently bad. The second argument, however, is about bad processing. The European Dairy Association is making the argument that sweeteners and flavors are added to plant-based milk to enhance the flavor, something that dairy milk doesn't need. A study from the Journal of Functional Foods does confirm that sugarcane is frequently added, which negatively impacts oral health. The American Society for Nutrition gives a concise breakdown of other nutritional factors. Dairy alternative milks tend to have fewer calories, less fat, more water content, and less protein. Some are fortified with other vitamins and nutrients. They go on to say that growing children benefit from dairy milk to an extent not worth ignoring if considering giving children plant-based milk instead. It strikes me that each kind of milk, both dairy and all kinds of plant-based milks, come with trade-offs. In a world where one can get their nutrients from anywhere, it isn't necessarily a problem. That being said, when factoring in cost and the knowledge of oneself as to whether that protein and fat from a nutritious source can be found elsewhere in your diet, it is a personal choice. But I think one should hesitate before ruling out dairy milk. According to the National Institute of Health, other minerals, such as magnesium, potassium, and phosphorus, are unique to dairy milk compared to its alternatives. While potassium is readily available in something like a banana, milk also has sodium. Plant-based milks can as well, but it's the combination of the two that is crucial. Reddit user Hems86 explains why. The sodium-potassium pump has the job of keeping the axon of neurons ready for the next electrical signal in the nervous system. Without this process, the electrical signals of the nervous system would not be able to travel from neuron to neuron. You experience this at a low level when you get muscle cramps. The gradient between sodium and potassium also helps control the osmotic pressure inside cells and powers a variety of other pumps that link the flow of sodium ions with the transport of other molecules, such as calcium ions or glucose. Long story short, without potassium, you are dead. Now, obviously, I'm not making the argument that choosing plant-based milks over dairy milk will kill you, but the convenience of keeping that sodium-potassium pump going from one beverage is undeniable and something that humans have been able to process lactose have benefited from for thousands of years. The alternative to this, for say someone who's exerting themselves, would be Gatorade. But for when you're not pushing your body to the ragged edge, there's no denying that milk from a cow is the healthier choice. As to which kind of milk is best, draw your own conclusions, but let's assume for a moment that you think dairy milk is best. That doesn't necessarily address our initial question. What is milk? The European Dairy Association, the Codex of General Standards for the Use of Dairy Terms, and the European Court of Justice all have that dairy requirement. History and the societal lexicon do not. I'm tempted to say that milk is one word with multiple meanings. That is consistent with the Oxford English Dictionary and would make this more of an issue of imprecise communication and less an issue of what milk is. But of course, there's more to it than that. Teleology is a philosophy which explains an object or an action based on its end or its purpose. This perspective is the wrench in the entire debate that I just cannot get out of my head. The argument is as follows. P1. The primary purpose of consuming milk is to obtain essential nutrients such as calcium, protein, and vitamins. P2. Both dairy milk and plant-based milk can effectively provide these essential nutrients necessary for human health, albeit to varying degrees, but not to such an extent that its purpose is entirely different. P3. Milk, whether dairy or plant-based, serves a functional role in various culinary and dietary practices. It is commonly used as an ingredient in cereal, coffee, baking, cooking, and as a standalone beverage. P4. The widespread use of milk in diverse culinary applications indicates its integration into human practices over time. This integration suggests that milk, regardless of its source, fulfills a specific role in enhancing the flavor, texture, or nutritional value of various dishes and beverages. P5. The absence of a distinguishing factor between dairy milk and plant-based milk in their application suggests an adaptive efficiency in meeting human needs. Both types of milk are utilized interchangeably in recipes and beverages, indicating that their essential functions, such as providing creaminess, enhancing flavor, or serving as a binding agent, are fulfilled, irrespective of their source. Conclusion. The lack of a distinguishing factor between dairy milk and plant-based milk can be seen as a testament to the adaptive nature of human dietary practices, with both options effectively serving the fundamental purpose of providing essential nutrients to support human health and well-being. The seamless interchangeability of dairy milk and plant-based milk in culinary applications highlights their functional equivalence in serving human needs. As both purposes are equal, so too are the milks. The deontological rebuttal to this would essentially be that the use of the word milk should only be used by manufacturers when it is clearly true, as misleading the consumer does not necessarily mean that the consumer has made a free choice when purchasing the product, which would be a violation of a moral duty of the manufacturer. But the reason I'm swayed by the teleological argument I laid out in more detail is that the container almost never represents itself as just being milk. It's soy milk, it's almond milk, it's oat milk, but again, it's not just milk. In that sense, I think it's perfectly reasonable for these plant-based milk companies to be able to use the word. On the other side of the coin, I think it's fair to acknowledge that I have always assumed that when someone uses the word milk with no specifier, that person is referencing dairy milk. And I will continue to operate on that assumption. While we've beaten the question of what is milk to death, I think it's fair to say that milk isn't the only word that human beings have disagreements about. I think most division from social issues stems from operating with different definitions, and that people would be better served by calibrating on what those words mean when engaging in discussion, instead of assuming the worst in those opposite them and preemptively assuming the moral high ground. I drink a lot of milk. This whole idea started when my wife, who knows I can't stand plant-based milk, introduced me to plant-based ice cream at a fancy supermarket. I had had a long day and was annoyed over people using the word milk in a way that I thought detracted from its true meaning. In all fairness, I was fully prepared for this video to be about how vegans have launched an assault on language and objective truth. Instead, I came away from this thing just a little bit more well-rounded. And I hope you did too. On that note, it's time to end. Thank you for watching.